Welcome, everyone. My name is Larry Edelson. I am the founder and the artistic and general director of American Lyric Theater, and I'm really thrilled to welcome you to this symposium session on Pathways to Opera for Dramaturgs. This is part of our Opera Writers Symposium, the third session of this season's symposium, and we're really happy to have you joining us. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to thank our funders, the National Endowment for the Arts, the New York State Council on the Arts, the Mellon Foundation, the Dubose and Dorothy Heyward Memorial Trust, the Howard Gilman Foundation, the Amphion Foundation, the Aaron Copland Fund for Music, and the Ditson Foundation for their support of our free programs to provide resources for opera composers, librettists, and dramaturgs. And we are also deeply grateful to all of our individual donors who have made a personal investment in our programs. Now, this evening, we have a pretty rare occasion. We bring together four dramaturgs together in the same room. Even if it's a virtual room, it's pretty rare that we get four dramaturgs together in the same room. So before I introduce each of our panelists, I want to acknowledge that part of the purpose of this session is to encourage applications to American Lyric Theater's Composer Librettist Development Program, through which we offer a special fellowship for opera dramaturgs. So we will be talking a bit about the CLDP this evening as well. So now I'd like to take the time to introduce each of our panelists, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves and to tell us about their journey to dramaturgy. The real question is, what were you doing creatively before exploring what a dramaturg does, and how did you find your way to working professionally as a dramaturg? And I'd like to start by introducing Cori Ellison, who is one of the founding faculty members at American Lyric Theater. I had the pleasure of first meeting Cori when I was working at New York City Opera, and she was the dramaturg at New York City Opera. Cori, how did you end up the dramaturg at New York City Opera? Tell us a little bit about your journey.
Well, it's all kind of a long, complicated story, but I'll just abbreviate it now, and hopefully we can talk a little more about the details later on. But what I like to say really is that I was born a dramaturg, and it took me a while to discover that because I had no idea what a dramaturg was, like most people, for a very long time. Um, and I was always my greatest interests were always music and theater, and I all I knew about was to be a performer. So that's kind of the track that I followed through school. And I was a theater arts major and a music minor at Hofstra University on Long Island. And then I was at Manhattan School of Music as a voice major, and then got out in the world and I was doing the freelance opera singer thing. And I discovered a couple of things about myself. And, one was that I didn't like being shut up all alone in a practice room, making pear-shaped tones as much as a lot of my singer friends did. And the place I wanted to go was the library or the rehearsal, to just like see what's going on. And so I discovered that, and I really, and also, I discovered that I was kind of like the little kid who gets a toy for Christmas, and the first thing they do is take it apart to see how it
Mhm.
works and how it all fits together. Um, and so I didn't have any idea that there was a place for that in the opera world, which is the world that I was in as a singer. But then I discovered at English National Opera, they had a long time wonderful dramaturg. Um, and my first trip to England, a mutual friend arranged for us to meet. And I followed him around for a day, and I thought, okay, he has the job that I want. That's what I want to do. And then it really didn't exist in opera in the US. So then my task was sort of to I don't know, like will it into being. And anyway, so to cut to the chase, how I ended up as dramaturg at New York City Opera, where I was for 14 really wonderful years, was that I had worked a lot as a freelance dramaturg with Francesca Zambello, great, very well-known American opera and theater director and intendant, and there was new management in New York City Opera. Paul Kellogg took over, and John Conklin was the like the associate artistic director. And they, because their goal was to be more sort of production oriented and move towards more thoughtful productions, they had a use for a dramaturg, and also they needed somebody to take over the super title department. So that was the first. So they said, well, as long as you're here, you know, and you're a dramaturg, how would you like to join us in that capacity and have super titles be a part of that? So I did, and I sort of invented the job there as I went along. And I think my colleagues may join me in saying that that's something that really happens when you become an institutional dramaturg, is that you sort of suss out what the needs are of that particular institution and you know, try to fill them as well as you can.
Right.
Anyway,
Yeah, well, we'll talk more about that as
yeah,
well, because I mean, as you alluded to, it's very common for a European opera house to have a resident dramaturg,
oh, yeah,
and you were kind of a unicorn in the United States, you know, in that way. So,
very much.
but let's introduce our next panelist, and we'll definitely dive into this more. We're very pleased to have with us Anne Cattaneo. Anne, would you join us on screen? And Anne, could you tell us about your journey to dramaturgy? What were you doing creatively before the dramaturgy bug bit you? And how did you find your way to working professionally as a dramaturg?
Well, I think we're all going to be telling the same stories. Just I am fortunate enough to be old, and being old means that when I went to college, which I didn't really want to go to, but I took a year off. I lived in Germany just as a student because I wanted to learn German. I lived with the family. But I went to college as a science major. And those were the days when you didn't have to know what you wanted to do when you were 14. You know, you could just kind of drift around. And I was pretty good. I took calculus, inorganic, physics. But when I found myself realizing that calculus classes were 5 days a week at 8 a.m., I got an A in the class, but I realized I can't do this. I just can't get up. So that was the end of my career in math. Had nothing to do with the math. It had to do with the hours, because I really am a night person. And so I was, you know, I was interested in languages. I spoke German. I speak French pretty well. I took some Italian lessons. This is the middle of, you know, San Francisco in the 60s. So there was a lot going on. And then I met in my final year, you know, trying to find a major. What was it going to be? You know, comp lit or something. I was given the gift of assisting the one of the directors at American Conservatory Theater in San Francisco, Edward Hastings, to whom I really owe my career. And he was directing a play at my college, Mills College, of a new playwright no one had heard of. This is in like 1971 or something, Lanford Wilson. And so I assisted Ed. I had a total crush on him. I had no idea he was gay. I just thought he was like an amazing person. He was one of the 4 directors of ACT. And he hired me to come over after my classes and assist him because he wanted to, it was a classical rep theater, wonderful theater back then under the direction of Bill Ball. He wanted to start working with new writers. And so I basically just read plays for him. And I did what I will, in my little remarks that I wrote up, urge everyone to do, which is just dip your toe into this world and see if you like it. And there are people who are very gifted who just don't like it. And there are other people who just take, when I saw that ghost light at the Geary, that was it, And there is something about being a member of a company, theater company in my case, that has been the same since the Greeks, I'm sure. And it just, that I was home. I can't tell you that. I had no interest in acting. I had, no interest in designing. So I really didn't, I was writing criticism. I had to take it to a commune in the hate to turn it into one of the underground papers. And we would sit on the floor and they would say, was this guy a revolutionary? And it was so easy because whether it was Moliere or Sam Shepard, I could say, yeah, he was a revolutionary. It's ridiculous. But anyway, so Ed said, why don't you go east? I went to college at the drama school at Yale the year that you were born. And I have all my notes and I'll give them to you. And so I applied to Yale. I didn't get in. I got waitlisted. So I kept working for Ed happily. And I'm also a very good seamstress. My mother taught me how to sew. So I made a lot of money in the costume shop. And that's one piece of advice. I just wrote this book about everything I know about dramaturgy in my book. And I said, if you want to know everything that goes on in a theater, learn to sew, because the people in the costume shop know everything. You just have to keep your head down, don't talk, and listen. So I got in a week before class started and I flew to the wrong airport. But that's when I began my studies, really having no basis, no training. But I had taken a few classes and they were training critics. I really didn't want to be a critic. And somehow I had heard of it. And I taught for a while. And then, again, it's in my book, but this always happens. And Cori's a good example of it too. I was freelancing everywhere. I was just saying yes to anything. And I was working at, I think, 4 little theaters. Between this, the checks for them, I was barely getting by. And one of them was Second Stage, which has now got 3 theaters, but it had that little uptown space on 78th Street only. And there were 4 women working there, 4 of us. Rosa Vega was the managing director, Carol Rothman and Robin Goodman. I was working like 2 days a week, and our receptionist was a guy. And it was interesting because there was never an emergency after 5 o'clock. I've never worked at a theater where there was everyone had kids, so it was like no emergencies. So, but Rosa Vega said, well, could everyone, their subscription is, could everyone take like 100 flyers and hand them out at the subway? And I thought, I'm only working here 1 day a week. It's going to take me half an hour to hand. So I took the flyers. So I'm standing at the train station, at the subway stations, handing the flyers out, and up the stairs comes Gregory Mosier from the Goodman, who I had met when I was at the Phoenix. That was my first job, because my roommate, the casting director, who was casting LA Law, used to put big stars in all the regional theater productions. So I knew him because he was one of the artistic directors and came in. So he said, what the hell are you doing here in the subway handing out the flyers? And I said, well, working at Second Stage. Oh, I just got a new job I'm running Lincoln Center. Why don't you come and see me? And that's how I got the job. But
quite fortuitous.
Later, it wouldn't happen.
Wonderful. Well, that's such a great story. Well, we'll kind of come back, and I know you have some thoughts that you wanted to share with us, but I want to make sure we have time to meet our other panelists. Our next dramaturg is Kate Pitt. Kate is a wonderful young dramaturg who actually came through our dramaturgy fellowship at ALT and is now working as a dramaturg around the country in opera and in theater. Kate, would love to hear about your journey.
Sure. Thank you for having me. So I grew up in New York City and went to a lot of opera. but was not a wildly musical child. So I thought I would always participate as an enthusiastic audience member. But I was recruited into college as an athlete without a ton of arts experience, but got very lucky in that I was at Yale, and the drama school, as Anne mentioned, is right there. And the dean of my college was a dramaturg, and I didn't know what that was. But I asked him, and he was very generous in talking to me. I met some of the dramaturgs who were studying at the drama school, one of whom, Tanya Dean, is an amazing still friend and mentor. I ended up double majoring in history and theater, and then went to the Folger Shakespeare Library in DC for 4 years after graduation, produced public programs and the theater there, and then went freelance, and then started with ALT studying with Cori in 2018.
Great. Thank you so much, Kate. And our final panelist, last but definitely not least, Annie Jin Wang. Would you join us? Annie, thank you so much for being here. Please, let's hear about your journey to dramaturgy.
Thank you so much. And I just want to say how humbled I am to be kind of in the presence of all of these legendary dramaturgs that I feel like I've heard so much about. It feels very surreal to be, sort of on a panel together. Yeah, my background is very much not in theater. I feel like I came to it comparatively late in my life. I grew up as an immigrant daughter. And so kind of just trying to understand like how I was going to make it in like the American school system. We immigrated here from China when I was 2.5. And so I just grew up sort of trying to absorb like all of the cultural things around me. And I ended up going to Wellesley College, where I studied art history and film. I thought I was really going to make my career in academia. I thought I was going to be a film scholar. But my thesis process just really burnt me out. And so I ended up going to Silicon Valley, where I worked in tech for 2 years. And during that time, I sort of realized that this was not, going to be the be-all end-all career path for me. And was trying to think back at that point, kind of a PhD in film was no longer in my sights. And so I was thinking about, well, what else did I really love doing while I was in college? And for all 4 years of my college career, I was a member of the Wellesley College Shakespeare Society, which I had started falling in love with Shakespeare when I was in high school, and had applied for and joined this society in college, thinking that I was going to approach it from a literary perspective. And then I just ended up falling in love with all aspects of the production process. And because we were a women's college, we didn't have cis men playing any of the roles. And so even though I didn't know that that was dramaturgy at the time, a lot of the thinking that we did around, how to think about things like casting in a way that didn't involve like body types and gender roles was like quite foundational to how I actually operate as a dramaturg today. And so kind of reflecting on how much fulfillment I got out of that process. And when I graduated, I really thought that theater was going to be like a college hobby. Like I thought I was going to graduate and then get a big girl job and then never think about theater ever again. But that was the thing that I came back to. And so I ended up meeting, I cold emailed my now mentor, Lily Tong Crystal, who is, for those in the Twin Cities, the incredible artistic director of Theater Moo, which is another company that I work with. At the time, she was the artistic director at a theater company in the Bay Area called Ferocious Lotus Theater Company. And she really took a chance on me because I didn't have any theater training. I didn't really have any professional theater experiences, but I was interested in sort of like, what might this look like to have a theatrical practice of any kind? And she, knew me for 3 months and then was willing to write me recommendations for MFA programs. And as I was kind of researching, I knew I wanted to do something that was like more academically oriented. And then I discovered, this word dramaturgy. For a while, I thought I might get my PhD in theater. And then I was talking to an alumna from my college who had done her PhD in theater. And she was like, based on what you're telling me, it kind of seems like you might want to be like a practitioner. Have you looked into MFA programs? And I said, oh, no. Like, there must be so many people who are qualified to be doing these, MFA dramaturgy programs who kind of came like tap dancing out of the womb. I'm not competitive, no way. And she was like, I think you should just try it. And so, you know, through these people kind of taking a chance on me, I applied to and matriculated through the Columbia MFA program in dramaturgy. So from then on, it was quite direct. I decided to apply. This was right after Trump was elected. And so my cohort was particularly self-selecting, I think. But, you know, I think everybody kind of had that sense that, you know, choosing to come to this program at this time was just, you know, it was a choice, and we were sort of committing to that. And so I started my MFA journey in dramaturgy, not exactly really knowing what dramaturgy was, but knowing that there were aspects of it that aligned with my interests. And I thought when I started that I was really going to focus on Shakespeare, and I was going to do, you know, kind of Shakespearean production dramaturgy forever. But as my program continued, I sort of really fell in love with this process of new works dramaturgy and of collaboration and of bringing, you know, new works into existence. And really that process of learning how to work with others and understanding what their generative styles are. And while I was in grad school, I was really lucky to have taken a class with Kate Lowell, who is the founding producer of the Play Company, which is a New York-based company that I am now on staff for. And, you know, I did an internship with the Play Company, and that really opened my eyes to how a lot of theater could be made. Columbia sent me to Croatia for a summer to study opera. That's how I got into opera, to assist on a production of Carmen with the Croatian National Theater. And then that was something that I had no experience in, but it was an opportunity to try something new. And I was like, I feel like I have to take it and see where it goes, and just ended up loving the form so much that I was like, I need another internship to like learn more about this. And so that's how I ended up interning with Paul Cremo at the Met. This was right before the pandemic. And then the pandemic started during my final semester in grad school. And so at that moment, I think all of us in every corner of the industry were really thinking about like, you know, what is the role? What is our work? What does it mean? What is it worth? What is the value? And those are a lot of the questions that still guide my work now. But because of these connections that I had just been very fortuitous to make as I was starting my journey, I've just been able to sustain, you know, my work as both an arts administrator and as a practicing dramaturg. And yeah, that's how my journey went.
Right. I love how easy you are all making this for me. I have to ask a simple question and then you just talk and say wonderful things. So I appreciate that. And you said something which I actually want to expand upon. You said, you know, you entered this program, Annie, not really knowing what a dramaturg does, right? And what is dramaturgy? I'd love to ask Anne, you know, you literally wrote the book on dramaturgy, The Art of Dramaturgy. And for those who aren't familiar with this book, I highly, highly recommend doing it. A quick plug for this phenomenal piece that this book that you wrote, Anne. But how do you describe what a dramaturg does?
Well, you know, I'm listening to these wonderful fellow panelists, and I wanted to just respond before I answer that question.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Say, you know, one of the things that we all do is that we look at things as they are. We look at things where they've come from. We look at where we want them to go. You know, we see this as a process. It's different in different theaters. It's different with different people. You know, it's absolutely the opposite of something where you have to, you know, where you learn calculus, where it's always the same, at least at the level that I got to. It's exactly the opposite. And because of my age, and because I really started working in the theater in the 70s, that's when I saw the ghost light and, you know, realized that was it. Life was so different from what it is now. And it will be, I hope to God, it will be very different in another 10 years or 15 years. There were no college programs, very few college programs in theater. Most people trained in conservatories. And conservatories were attached to theaters, like ACT had a conservatory, Cleveland had a conservatory, the Goodman had a conservatory, Stratford had a conservatory, the Pasadena Playhouse had a conservatory, Actors Theater of Louisville. And that was the way that it was an old sort of apprentice system. You carried spears, you sewed in the costume shop, you did whatever. And the most important thing was that you learned the ancient culture of theater. You learned how to collaborate. You learned what everybody else did, and you began to contribute in a way that was useful. You can go back. I mentioned in my little bibliography in my book, there's a wonderful book by Todd London. And Lawrence, maybe you could put that in the chat since I can't talk and type at the same time.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
But Todd London, who was the former head of New Dramatists, wrote a book called An Ideal Theater. It was published in 2013. And all it is the founding visions going back to about 1890 of, I don't know what the total is, maybe 100 American theaters. Everything from the Teatro Campesino to the Guthrie to Broadway theaters to, of course, the Federal Theater Project, which is enormously important in spreading theaters around the country, to Margot Jones, the Texas Tornado, who discovered Tennessee Williams, Free Southern Theater, Caramoo, all the big theaters in New York. And you can see in these, and each of them is maybe 2 pages long or something, that everyone is trying to do something else in a different way. If you look, when I started in the 70s, the theaters that were the hottest theaters, so let's say Steppenwolf or Sam Shepard or David Mamet or something, and none of those people had ever gone to school. Actually, the Steppenwolf people were students, and they just decided we have to put some plays on, so they were in Champaign-Urbana. Some of you may be from Champaign-Urbana, but it's not the place you would pick out as being the theater headquarters of America. It doesn't matter where you do it. And each one, like the group theater, were just incredibly starving immigrants. And they would, it was the 30s, it was freezing cold. The temperature had dropped that whole decade. It was cold. And they would take a 5-cent cup of coffee and sit in an automat all day and talk about theater and decide we have to make a new kind of theater, a theater that speaks to people like us. And then someone gave them a farmhouse and they went up together. And they literally would be like, if there were 6 of us here, it would say, you write the play. And no, you act in the play. And they got some of it right, but they got some of it really wrong. But, they figured out a style. They figured out a subject matter. They began to figure out how to write a play. That was Clifford Odette's job. And then when they came into an empty house, it was the Depression, down on Broadway, and put on, their first play, and Ilya Kazan, who was acting, that was a mistake, yelled strike, and 1,200 people stood up and said strike. They knew they were onto something. So the whole notion that you have to go to school and that you have to apply for a job, you can just make a theater with your friends, and if your theater is good enough, people will come and see it. So I do come from the beginnings of that. The Ford Foundation, right around the time I started in the theater, in a very enlightened way, built many of the large regional theaters today in an attempt to jumpstart theaters around the country. So the Arena Stage, Mark Taper Forum, Lincoln Center Theater, all of these gigantic buildings were built with Ford Foundation money. And they began to open, right around that time. And no one knew what to do. No one knew who would work in them. No one had any idea. And so people began to make a theater that was tied to the communities in some way. So I guess my point, before I say any more, because I like to talk a little bit about how you know you're a dramaturg or whatever, is that the moment that we're in is just the moment we're in. And I hope we get out of it for many reasons. But the theater is always changing. And there's, I mean, you just have to go back and read Stanislavski. Everything he saw in the theater when he started, he hated. And he decided to make an alternative. Turned out to be the Moscow Art Theater. He found a pretty good writer and some good actors, and now he's immortal. That's what you have to do, is you have to find your people and find where you're going to do that. And it might be in Chicago, it might be in Moscow, it might be in Los Angeles, it might be in Santa Fe, it might be. So there isn't one way. We have one way of doing it now. And it's a worrisome way to me because it involves so much money. But I just wanted to stress at the beginning that it's just the moment we're in. And the change that will come, as it has come for thousands of years, will come from you and your colleagues. And part of your job as a dramaturg is to find those colleagues and encourage those colleagues. So can I just say my piece and then shut up for the rest of the session?
Sure. I mean, I won't have you shut up, but I do want to, I do want to make sure we have time for everyone to talk. But yeah, so I really appreciate that, and I love what you're saying about, part of this is just getting out there and doing it, right? And it's I think that's critical, and I'd love to hear. You mentioned that you had jotted down some bullet points that you wanted to share specifically. Why don't we go to those, Anne?
Okay. I wrote them down just because I wanted to mention them. I think the most important thing for those of you who are listening is, however you could do this, is you need to become familiar with the world of opera and the world of opera production, however you can. It's very, very, very difficult to excel in opera, in composing an opera, in singing an opera, in directing an opera, in designing an opera. It's sort of like football. Watching Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift, I couldn't do that. Not many people can make an opera. Not many people can do what those of you on the Zoom who do this professionally do. Not many people can sing like that. Not many people can direct it. Not many people can, it's very, very difficult. And it has, like football, its own culture. It's very unique. I mean, you see these things in sports where people are pounding each other and you think, what does this mean? I don't like this. But we have our own way of communicating that is the same in all theaters and the same in all operas. And you have to see if you like it by trying to be a part of it. And I would say doing that means by assisting, by interning, by obviously watching and learning from the other collaborators how they function, what they do.
And I would just interject here. I mean, that is actually so much a part of why we created the fellowship at ALT, is to immerse aspiring dramaturgs in the world of opera, not only in the world of writing opera, but seeing as much opera as possible, learning about the history. And we'll talk a little more about that with Cori, because as you say, you have to be completely embedded in this world and have the perspective of the historical perspective, not just focused on what's happening now, because everything that's happening now is born out of what has happened in the past in some way or another. So
that's sort of our bailiwick. I mean,
right.
I knew a number of very, very talented actors as I began my career who just couldn't take the lifestyle. They were brilliant, but they were employed, then they were not employed. That's an actor's life. And they left the theater. They just couldn't take it. So it's this funny combination of your own gifts, but also do you love the form enough? Do you love the outsider nature of being an actor? And when I first had the opportunity to be at ACT, as I wrote in my notes here, I saw the ghost light and there was no going back. I can't explain it. It just was like, this is it. And I didn't, had not heard of dramaturgy, but I knew I certainly knew that I didn't want to act and I didn't want to sew for the rest of my life. But I knew that, you know, somehow I was going to get in there.
Yeah.
Right now, I've been working at Lincoln Center Theater. I'm just retired, but I've worked there for 40 years. And the theater right now is very confused. I mean, the whole world is confused and the country is confused because I think it's being sort of led by TV stars and rich amateur producers at the moment who just don't have the chops to know how to do this.
I'm not going to disagree with you, but I do want to try to center us a little bit back onto the specifics of this session, because I think, and we could talk a long time about many of these subjects, but you said something that actually I want to ask Cori to respond to a little bit, because the idea of being immersed in opera, and that's, you know, what you did to become an opera dramaturg, right? I mean, because you are really exclusively an opera dramaturg. You don't work in straight theater. And you're really a pioneer in the United States when it comes to dramaturgs. It's common, as I said, in European opera houses to have a resident dramaturg, but you were really the first to work as a house dramaturg at New York City Opera. Can you share with us really what that immersion means to you, and then how does that manifest itself in terms of the different roles that a dramaturg has inside an opera house? We're going to dig into the new works development process, but I know, having worked with you at City Opera and other places, that's not what it's all. I mean, there's so many different things that encompass that for you.
Yeah, you know, being an institutional dramaturg in opera, and by the way, in Europe, particularly in the German-speaking countries, and to some extent also in France and in the Nordic countries, they have not. Small opera houses have not a dramaturg, but they have a dramaturgy department where the city of Berlin, which has three major opera companies and a number of smaller ones, the city of Berlin has more opera dramaturgs than this entire country does.
Wow.
So we're trying to fix that, Larry, right?
He's bit by bit, yes, but we have some work to do.
We do. But in terms of being an institutional dramaturg in opera in this country, there are very few. But it's you know, just a wonderful, wonderful job. And I think it's quite analogous to, I'm sure, what Anne did for so long at the Lincoln Center Theater. I would say, you know, philosophically, you're sort of a bridge between a lot of different constituencies in an opera house. The public, the staff, the artists, and so I think, you know, the nucleus of it is that to understand the institution itself, the mission of that company, and then also to understand the individual productions so that you can communicate to all those constituencies and that the messaging that comes out of the company is consistent. I mean, did you ever see a company whose, you know, development materials and marketing materials and publicity materials all look like they came from different places? They're not talking about the same,
Right.
you know, I mean,
yeah.
So, you know, it really is to kind of try to understand and focus the message of the company itself and its particular projects. And the tributaries that you have access to as a company dramaturg to do that are publications and other media, nowadays podcasts and videos and things like that, besides the traditional program books and brochures. And it's working with what the department that we're no longer supposed to call the education department, but you know, to you know, present relevant programs for the public. And it's also working with the marketing department to help them craft their messaging. And then also working with the performers. This gets into the production end of things, where as an institutional dramaturg, you're working constantly with directors and designers and to some extent conductors as well, especially when you're doing operas like, let's say, Carmen or the Tales of Hoffmann, that have a lot of choices that have to be made. There's a lot of alternate materials, and so you have to know a lot about the history of those pieces and make choices about what parts you're gonna do and not do. And to work with creative teams on crafting new productions. So you'll be called upon to do anything from a lot of research, and it depends really on the directors. I mean, some directors, they want you to come in and drop a pile of books on their desk and go away, but some directors really want you to be involved in the developing of the ideas that go into the production and how they manifest visually and through the performers. They want you to be at rehearsals, and that's a joy when creative teams invite you into the process, and you can be very, very helpful. You can sort of be their secret weapon.
Right. Well, and then there's new works dramaturgy as well, which is a separate avenue, right?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
And Kate put a wonderful quote in from Todd London, which in the chat, and I'll read it just to make sure everyone heard it. And that quote is, "I realize that the job of dramaturgy isn't to identify what's wrong with plays and help fix them. Rather, the work was to encourage or inspire writers back to their desks, to embolden them to go the rest of the way." And reading that makes me think of watching you work, honestly. I mean, because we've worked together for like almost 20 years now, which is really scary. But I'm curious, how specifically in the new works sphere you define your role.
Uh-huh. Oh, this is interesting. Well, first of all, I did want to say that, my background, having become a complete opera geek at the age of 7 and then like immersing myself in it, that my background was entirely in canonic repertory. And that's what I knew, and that's what I loved when I came to City Opera. And it's really when I came to City Opera that I kind of got thrown into the world of new works. And that's something I think probably differs from the experience of an American theater dramaturg, because at most repertory theaters, you're constantly dealing with new works, whereas in opera, as many people know, this real boom in commissioning and developing new opera, which has just, I never thought I would see this blossoming of activity in new opera that has developed. I mean, certainly when I first started working at City Opera, it was just in its infancy, but now, I mean, it was really City Opera that drew me into that world, and I had to respond. And the reason I'm saying this is because I had this very deep background in canonic rep, that I naturally would draw parallels constantly, like when I was working on new works with composers and librettists, that um, any problem they would have, any challenge that they would face, would remind me of something that I knew from a canonic opera. And as you know, I still use this type of thing to teach at ELT and elsewhere, where, okay, I see you're having this problem. Okay, so go look at the third act finale of Otello, and let's listen to that, or because I really do believe what you were saying before, Larry, that it's important for creators of new works to understand, their heritage. And no matter how hard you fight against it, it's still your heritage. A lot of, I've met a lot of contemporary creators who sort of don't naturally embrace that, but it's your toolbox. Even if you don't like the stuff for whatever reason, you can't deny that all of the tools are there. So anyway, just in terms, I'll just say a few more things about working with composers and librettists. Often, people joke when I was dramaturg on Hadrian by Rufus Wainwright and Dallin McIver a couple of years ago at Canadian Opera. Rufus used to call me Switzerland because that's one thing that you have to do, is be very good at conflict, dealing with and resolving conflict, because artists, they're big personalities, and they're very passionate about what they do. And I think a lot of the art of being a dramaturg for new works is leading the collaborators to see that they're really after the same thing, and they may have very, very different ways of expressing it, and to try to lead them to the points of intersection so that they can kind of reconnect. And that's a lot of experience and intuition and stuff like that. That's another part of it. And the other thing is, it's also like being a diagnostician. I often say that because it's sort of like you have to be very objective. You are paid to be the objective person in the room. That, it's like the doctor that's just analyzing what's going on in the physiology, not editorializing about it. You don't go to the patient, oh my God, you're so sick, you're going to die. You say, okay, here's what I hear and here's what I see, and let's talk about it. And then the other thing too, it's a little bit like being, you're going on a road trip with two people, let's say, and they want you to be they want you to help navigate, and you might know what you think is the best route to get there, but first you have to let them, they have their visions of how they want to get there and where they want to get, and your job is to help them get where they want to go in the clearest and most effective way possible. So you're not there to tell them what to do, but to find out what they want to do and try to help them do that. And there are times too where they're going to drive off a cliff, and then you have to say, okay, let's pull over to the side and see if we can not drive off that cliff.
You mentioned,
Anyway.
serving a little bit like Switzerland. I've heard you use that analogy before, of course. And I think, one of the big differences in the new works development process for opera versus a play is a playwright is, usually writing themselves, unless it's a collaborative work of some sort. And in an opera, you do have two different worlds coming together, the world of music, the world of text, right? And I think that is also speaks to the skill sets that an opera dramaturg needs to develop, needs to be able to speak the language of the composer and speak the language of the librettist, and sometimes translate for each other.
Oh, yes.
I'd love to actually talk to Kate for a little bit. We had a question. I do want to remind everyone we have a Q&A. So if you do have questions for the panelists, please don't put them in the chat, but please put them in the Q&A so that I will see them. Mary Elizabeth Williams asks, she would love to have some more information about how the program at ALT unfolds for the fellows. How did you interact with the composers and the librettists who were in the program? And then how did that interaction combined with your work with Cori or me or Mark Adamo, how did that inform your development as a dramaturg?
Yeah. So we were very lucky, speaking to Cori's point about needing to know, and Anne's point as well, about needing to know the canon. In that I think the other dramaturg apprentice and myself were very lucky in that we came in sort of out of year. So our first year was really just the two of us, just studying with Cori and getting an opera boot camp, and getting to watch her work and getting to really have learn the vocabulary that we needed to work in opera. That is different. I came in with a dramaturgy practice in theater, but there were quite literally vocabulary words in opera that I didn't know that I needed to learn. So that was really valuable. And because ALT afforded us the opportunity to observe workshops that were going on, I got to meet some of the composers and librettists from past years, and met some collaborators who I'm still working with, which is really incredible. So I think it will be slightly different for the folks who are coming in who will be in a class of their own and sort of have composers and librettists who are in the same class. But part of what was great was being out of a class. We were sort of in every class. And we got to meet everyone, the composers and librettists, and see how Cori worked with them, and meet future collaborators and friends.
Right. And then when you were participating in classes of a first year cohort, you were involved. I mean, we're very Socratic in terms of the way we work and have dialogue about the exercises that writers are working on, but you were participating in the discussion about the work as well, right? And you were seeing how Cori might communicate about work, how I might communicate, how Mark Campbell or Mark Adamo might communicate. And so did you find that seeing these different ways of developing the work informed you? Were you really just leaning into your prior practice? I mean, what sort of tools did you get? I mean, you got experience doing, obviously, being in the program. Were there specific tangible things that you find that you're still now drawing on now that you're outside of ALT and working, at other companies?
Absolutely. I think sort of what you pointed to of this, the Socratic method, and what Cori described as finding out what the artists and the art wants and then providing that, was really useful in terms of your practice of using Lerman feedback and being very sensitive to the needs of the process. That when someone offers a dramaturg or sort of invites them into their process, it's very vulnerable, and not necessarily coming in and saying, this is what I think. Even if someone asks that, that's not always what they want. But asking lots of questions in a Socratic way and sort of learning how other artists ask those questions, was incredibly valuable. And that process, Lerman, is something that I still use in my practice, both in opera and that I've used in theater as well. So that was incredibly valuable.
And just I will mention our next symposium session is actually with Liz Lerman in May. So if you're not familiar with her work, or even if you are, it's a session that's not to be missed. Annie, I wanted to dive into some talk with you because we haven't worked together, and I know you had the opportunity to work with Paul Cramo at the Met. You're now working on some projects with Beth Morrison projects. It sounds like, and correct me if I'm wrong, that what Anne was referring to before about being immersed in the opera world is exactly what you did by getting this internship with Paul. Talk a little bit about what that was like, and then how that has informed the work that you're doing now.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I would say that when I started working with Paul, it was, I would say we worked primarily on actually new works. So for me, I basically read a lot of librettos, and there was quite a lot of sort of research involved, in terms of, we were trying to think of, like, similarly to trying to bring in sort of dramaturgs into the fold, people who might have the skill set but may feel that they don't have the experience or like specific knowledge to be successful in opera. A lot of the work that we did was actually in researching folks that we thought might have the right instincts for the work, as well as trying to, recommend to them and create a roster of pieces or stories that we felt like might translate into an operatic form. And so in that way, a lot of the way that I was thinking was kind of in terms of learning about opera through like the qualities that make an opera successful, and then what parts of a story that is not already operatic might translate well, or might spark something for a writer. And in that regard, I feel like I just learned so much through immersion of reading librettos that were sent to the Met and organizing them. And, the Met did not commission or develop or produce every single piece that we read, but just being able to read dozens of new works that were being made, just sort of gave me a good idea of what was out there, what were people interested in, what kinds of stories, what kinds of musical styles. Similarly, while I was there, the pieces that were in development at the Met were The Hours and Eurydice, which, if you recall, both premiered a couple of seasons ago. And a lot of the work that I did with Paul there was to go through the librettos and, just from my perspective, think about dramaturgically, how were they working? And, for example, for The Hours, I actually wasn't very familiar with the novel or the film. And so I watched both things. And then I would read the libretto and think about, okay, what is the story that is being told here? And how are the arias, sort of evoking a certain amount of interiority that might be reflected in a certain way in a literary context, in a different way in a filmic context, and now in an operatic context. So there's an element of triangulation there as well. And I think through that, because I spent so much time, looking at the bones of new works, I think that, and understanding that there wasn't actually as much distance between, at least opera dramaturgy at the libretto stage, and the, more kind of straight play and conventional theater dramaturgy that I was more experienced in at the time. And being able to know that even though I didn't have a lot of the specific vocabulary or musical training, that there was still something in my knowledge base and in my instincts as a dramaturg that would translate successfully. And so when I started working with Beth and the two teams of artists that I'm currently working with, both teams are making their first operas. They're incredibly accomplished composers, but they haven't necessarily written something in an operatic form before. And so actually a lot of our work together in that regard is there's a lot of, I would say, I usually think about my own dramaturgy as a form of facilitation, and that although I'm quite the talker, I spend maybe 95% of my time actually just listening and just trying to download everything that the composers and librettists are thinking about, what their process is. That takes time. For me, I would say that the most valuable aspect that I think I hold as a dramaturg is understanding that trust takes time to build. And that, similar to what Kate and Cori have said, that going into a process, trying to assert a sense of authority may not always be effective, especially if the artists that you're working with are already, frustrated with where they are in the process. And so I just spent, a lot of time just understanding where have they been, what was the spark or the thing that initially excited them about the work that they did, and then kind of going through my own Rolodex of references and experiences to help them get to a place where they can feel safe looking at the thing as it is, as opposed to how they've built it up in their heads because of how long they've been on it. I feel that oftentimes the work that I do as a dramaturg in opera as in straight plays is also just try to restore self-trust in the artist through the process of listening and of reflecting back to them what I process their process to be, if that makes sense. Because through all these conversations, I think I like to learn a lot about how these artists are working. And every artist has a different process. And sorry to digress just a little bit, but in as one of the unfortunately few, kind of female BIPOC dramaturgs that is, working professionally. Although I have a lot of friends who are really up and coming, and I think it's really exciting that the American theater is making more room for artists of color in all fields, that a lot of the work that we do together is also this process of kind of decolonization, of understanding how artists have been trained in a lot of these conservatory programs, and how much of the processes that they have been trained in might actually be holding them back from telling the stories that they want to tell. And a lot of times I find that the fear and frustration that artists experience stem from being trained in a way that doesn't necessarily serve how they want to build stories. And so to sort of, I guess, sum all of that up, there's, I think, a lot of listening and a lot of just understanding artists' individual journeys in order to be able to build the amount of trust and communication to be able to support them. And I think that's kind of a universal thing that anybody can do. I don't think that you necessarily need to have reached a certain amount of knowledge in a field to be able to do that. Although I think it's important to have the curiosity and the urge to learn more once you're being invited into those rooms.
Great. Well, I really appreciate those comments. Thank you, Annie. One of the questions that Marjorie Rush has asked is to discuss how you interact with stage directors. I'm going to touch on this first. Cori's going to laugh as I probably talk about this a little bit, because as a stage director myself, who now does work sometimes as a dramaturg, I think they're extremely different processes, and I'm always surprised when a director serves as a dramaturg on their own piece or something that they're working on. For me, I have to divide the two completely, and I always recommend it, though I know some people do both simultaneously. I think of a director as an interpretive artist, and a dramaturg I tend to think of more as a facilitative artist, especially in terms of the new works development process. And so that's been very important for me, and I think a lot has to do with the fact that I was trained by Cori as well. So, and that and watching and how she works with people. But I think it would be really interesting, and Cori, I'd love for you to start touching on this in terms of, how does a dramaturg interact with a stage director, and that may be different in sort of a production environment versus in a new works development process, because in some new works development processes, the director is brought in quite early, and in others, the director is not brought in until much later in the process. Cori?
Yes, I think that the reason why there's such different roles, as you observed, is that a director, especially an opera director who is usually accustomed to canonic rep, is very oriented towards kind of fixing problems in the dramaturgy of received repertory through the production, So very often when I've worked with directors in the development process, their instinct will be to say, oh, well, I fix that with staging, or, we can take care of that. And I'll always have we always talk at ALT about baking it in, as you're working out the bugs in the piece itself, so the piece arrives to be produced in the most airtight way possible. We joke about making it director proof. I mean, that's a joke, but I mean, in other words, to look at the piece itself having that kind of innate integrity, instead of arriving as something that has to be helped or fixed by a director rather than interpreted.
Great. No, I appreciate that. Definitely. We're coming on to the last sort of 15 or 20 minutes of our session, and I would love if each of you could share with us just some stories about a particular project in opera that you worked on, or that you were working on that you're finding very rewarding, and why that process has been or was rewarding. What was it about the process, and the project itself that really made you feel satisfied in terms of your work as an opera dramaturg? Kate, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Um, so a little bit about a project I'm working right now, which is possible piece of ALT, which is American Apollo, which is going to premiere at Des Moines Metro Opera this summer, which is with Damien Dieter wrote the music, and the brilliant Lila Palmer, who is an ALT alum, wrote the libretto. And it's Lila and I connected through ALT. We went to a Met dress rehearsal together. We're seated next to each other and got on famously. And part of what I love about this project is it's about the American theater John Singer Sargent and one of his models, Thomas McKellar. It's a period of American history, the 19th century, which is what I studied in college. So I really love that era of American history. But I didn't know a lot about the painter or his history or art history in general. So it's been really wonderful to dive deep into that world. And also I was invited onto the project at a point when it was still early in the process of being written. So we can talk forever about sort of when is the best time to bring on a dramaturg in the project. But this has been really fulfilling because I came at a point where the artistic partnership between the composer and the librettist was already incredibly solid. I have not had to be Switzerland, which has been wonderful, even though I enjoy that part of my job. But both the company, Des Moines, has been incredibly welcoming and supportive of everyone in the process, given the time that's needed to make that opera happen. And opera takes time. Baking things in takes a long time. So that's sort of a process that I've been involved with for a couple of years, and has been incredibly creatively satisfying, both because of the company and the other creatives and the process and the subject matter. It's been a dream. So come see it in June if you're going to be in
Absolutely.
Iowa.
I will be there for sure. And I'd love to hear, I know you've done more work in theater, but you have had a couple really fascinating opera experiences. Can you share with us a bit about that?
Um, I, 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 I haven't had many, as I said. Um, I have my black mug, my cup from the Met, because I did The Great Gatsby, which was a new work, with an incredibly interesting cast. Jerry Hadley, Lorraine Hunt Lieberman, I'm sorry, Susie Graham, um, Wayne Croft, in the Levine era. It was just really an immersion in this. Um, I just wanted to add, since I've done so many commissions, I've done so many new plays, I've done so many classical interpretations, which I find fascinating. Just a note that you brought up, Lawrence, at the very, very beginning. Um, if you look at the people that you're working with in the rehearsal room in opera, they're so highly trained. They've spent so many years working on their voice, the repertory. They're doing new operas now. You know, you as a dramaturg who join them in this room, or you join the director or the producer to commission something. I mean, you may start. I've done many commissions where I will choose the director, you know, because you don't know what it's going to turn out to be. But what they do is extremely hard. I mean, I remember having conversations with Peter Sellers when he started out trying to do something, and it was just, people would say, and Jerry Hadley said this, I know, in rehearsals for Gatsby, to Mark, I know what you want me to do. You want me to bend over here or sit down, but I can't produce the sound that I need to produce if I'm doing that. And that's something that you hear in the theater. You have to ask and understand what's appropriate given the circumstances that you're working with. And for us as dramaturgs, that means our obligations are language obligations, repertory obligations. We need to know the history. We need to know the work of new writers, new composers, in the case of opera, to see what they've done and where they can be encouraged to go that they haven't gone. so I keep coming back to the sports metaphor. You're not going to walk out on a football field and carry the ball down there. You'll have no idea what you're doing. You have to practice since the time you were 10 to figure out not only the rules, but how to do it and how to do it in your own way. And our obligations as dramaturgs are as difficult as it is difficult to sing. What's the hardest opera to sing? I don't know. I mean, that's what we have to respect is what they have to do and what we can bring. So obviously, as Cori says, she knows the music. She's known that for a long time. If it's written in another language, you should know the language. You should know the repertory that comes out of it. Michel Saint-Denis, who was one of the great, he's founded Juilliard, he felt, and I think this is, I wrote about this in my book, so I'm not going to go into this too much, that if you understand how a work that exists already worked in its own time, why did these Mozart operas succeed? What were the elements besides, who was he, even what was his voice, but where were they done? How were they done? Who sang what? You need to know all of that. You're never going to replicate that. That's ridiculous. But you need to understand by having as much of a knowledge base as these singers have had by singing for 10 years before you've met them. They've sung and they've sung and they've sung. And you need to know the same thing. And when you then know that, you can begin to figure out how to transpose that into a modern production that will, be completely new, that will, as Peter said, be set in an airport, or whatever. Yeah. But you respect what is needed to allow that to blossom.
Absolutely. And we talk about that all the time at ALT, again, we're not asking anyone to write like Mozart and Da Ponte, but understanding how they did, what they did, the craft is something that is critical to building your own storytelling, in a contemporary context. So.
Or if you're working on a Mozart opera, you need to understand.
Yeah. Or, well, yes, if you're directing or being in a Mozart opera, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean,
Annie.
Just to finish up.
Sorry. Yes.
But what I ended up doing, and it's very ironic because I subscribed to the New Yorker and I got the New Yorker last week. When I was working on Gatsby, I thought, what can I bring to this? And it turned out that I knew Irving Berlin's daughters. And Irving Berlin, the great Irving Berlin, married a wasp princess. I mean, like the the house in the Gatsby is in the North Shore. And that's where Irving Berlin lived when he married whatever her name was, the mother, Barrett. And the daughter was
Mary Ellen Barrett. Yeah.
Mary. So I invited Marianne Barrett to come to the rehearsal. And in the New Yorker this past week, if you have it, you should look at it. There's an article, to my astonishment, considering I'm on this Zoom panel, about Jesse Bancroft, who founded the American Posture League in 1914 to help Americans change their posture. And they were influenced by progressive education advocates, etc. So I'm just reading this article about posture. And then it says, on the other hand, the embrace of individualism has its own postural perils. Among the bugbears of early posture advocates was the debutante slouch, a fashionable stance associated with less restrictive garments in which the hips jut forward and the shoulders stoop. This way of standing was seen as an embodiment of high-class decadence. In The Great Gatsby, coincidence, huh? The first thing that Nick Carraway notices about Jordan Baker is her failure to slouch. She has, quote, an erect carriage, which she accentuated by throwing her body backwards at the shoulders like a young cadet. Though her posture is the only thing upright about her, she's also an incurably dishonest woman. So the idea of standing and moving and how you go across the stage ended up being the most important thing that was part of our production. It had nothing to do with the text, had nothing to do with the music, even though I read the score and, you know, I play the violin, so I could understand it. It had to do with what Marianne Barrett knew as a child growing up in a mansion, I mean, an enormous house, and who had that in the production and who didn't, who knew how to walk like that and who didn't. And the singers, I shouldn't call them actors, the singers were very interested in that. Very, very interesting.
I love that you're bringing that up because you're talking about it in the context of a production and how the performers or how the directors might be influenced by this information about posture. And as you're saying this, I'm noticing how much I slouch and I need to sit up better in my chair. But I would argue that also from a dramaturg's perspective in a new works development process, if I were working on a Great Gatsby opera, I'd want the composer and librettist to know about that because there might be something musically that helps with the representation of the way that the performer is actually carrying themselves. There might be something textual in the libretto, right? And this is where dramaturgs can provide this kind of information to feed into something that you might not think actually is part of the compositional process. You might think, oh, this is the director's bailiwick, but I would argue it actually is very much part of the new works development process, you know.
We're all in the circle together.
Absolutely. Yeah.
The challenge for me working on this, and I did this one other piece with Andreas Scholl, who's a wonderful countertenor that I did called Renaissance Muse. The problem that I found in opera was that everything had to be decided way, way ahead. I mean, the sets were fixed 3 years before I came on board, and everything had to work within, you know, exactly how they had to move. And that's definitely not the case in the theater. We're much more flexible, and my work is always at least a year before the rehearsals begin, sometimes 2 years.
Yeah.
And it was hard for me to, you know, and also the rigidity. I mean, I remember Jerry Hadley saying, if you want this sound, you can't ask me to do this because there's only one way I can make this sound. Sure. And that's not what we're used to. But I'll finish my evening with one funny story. It was the Levine era, which was very strange. A lot of bad people in opera sometimes. I don't think quite as often in theater. But anyway, so I watched your orchestra rehearsal, which was really interesting to watch him work. And then in the tech, no one was in that tech. There was no one. There was the tech table, me, Mark, and Levine was conducting. And in the middle of the tech rehearsals, like 11 in the morning, the door opened and in came Joe Volpe with a VIP with a little security patrol. And they went right down to the end of the first act and talked to Levine. And I thought, who the hell is this? That's so important. It was Giuliani. And finally, to end the story, we went back, we tacked the second act. And I'm the only person who isn't doing anything because I'm just watching. And Susie Graham is singing the green light, the green light. And the idea, of course, is that there is no green light. You know, it's over. She doesn't call for him. And I'm sitting there alone in the Metropolitan Opera, and there is a green light blinking. So I sort of tiptoe up to the tech table and say, is the green light supposed to be blinking right now? Isn't the whole point that it isn't blinking? And they were like, oh my God. So I felt that was my major contribution.
I'm sure you did more than that for sure, but I'd love to make sure we just have time to talk with Cori and Annie about the very meaningful things that they've worked on. Annie, could you share with us something that you have worked on or something that you are working on right now?
Yeah. So actually, when you extended me this very generous invitation to be a part of this panel, I was actually on my way to California to do the first workshop with one of the BMP projects that I'm on, which is an opera called Star Singer, and the composer is Juhi Bansal, and the librettist is Neil Aitken. And they had you know, an existing collaboration before writing song cycles, but this was really their first opera. And I think I joined the project in, I want to say maybe early 2000, like 2023. And we had these conversations, and Neil came from more of like a prose background. And so a lot of our early work was in just trying to understand like what a musical structure could look like, what an operatic structure could look like for this story that they were telling, which is sort of a heroine's journey where, it's a coming of age story where a young woman has to kind of go through all these spiritual realms in order to recover a song that her mother, who's part of a lineage of women, who like sang to keep the stars in the night sky alight. It's a very like kind of parable-esque fairy tale story. And the sort of musical heart of it is that every realm that she goes into takes inspiration from a different Asian folk tradition. And so the piece that we were workshopping at USC is this third movement, which kind of utilizes Buddhist chants and Sanskrit language. And we had been having a lot of different conversations around what text should look like on a page, because some of the music for this piece, the lyrics were literally like the same phrase repeated 20, 30 times to kind of create this sense of, almost like to induce kind of like a trance-like state in the audience. And also for the character that's kind of going through this world. And for us, there's, I think, interestingly, sometimes I think about a libretto almost like a score, or sometimes there's like plays that I read that I say, this play almost reads like a score, in that how language is placed on a page, how text is placed on a page can help a director understand kind of how to direct the thing. And for this, I think there was still, at the time that we went into the rehearsal, there was still a little bit of distance between how we could imagine the piece laying based on what we were reading and musically how it would seem. And stepping into that rehearsal for the first time and listening to the fullness of the music, and Juhi also really wanted kind of electronics as part of the composition of the score. And so seeing how that and hearing how that added to it, there's such an experiential and visceral experience, I think, to it as well. I think one danger as a dramaturg that I think every dramaturg kind of experiences at some point in a process is like you feel yourself starting to get towards like the intellectual cliff of a piece, and sometimes it's like getting to see the thing and hear the thing on its feet puts you back in the body. And I think for all of us on the team, getting to hear that music in the space for the first time, sung by these incredible students from the USC Music School, for whom this was, working on new opera for them was also a completely new experience. And I think that's something that is also so valuable for students, even if you are in vocal performance or music, and not necessarily in the process of like creating opera specifically, that getting the opportunity to work on and develop a new piece that's like in service, to be in service of a writer who is writing music for you to sing, I think for all of us was just such a special experience. We're very excited for, we spent an entire week workshopping this 20, 30-minute piece of music. And every time it's almost like you're opening up a door to a new world, and getting to see the thing, everything that you know about an opera when you're only reading the libretto, kind of changes once music comes into play. And even though processes between, who writes and when the music is written in comparison to when the text is written might be different from artist to artist, it's like those things still are so enmeshed. And the first moment that we all looked at each other and was like, oh, this opera is going somewhere, like there is something that is so special here, that's just like it makes me feel completely fulfilled as a dramaturg to be able to be part of a process where the thing is starting to come together and everybody sees the spark.
Wonderful.
I'm sure we'll have more on that.
Yes, well, thank you, Annie. We are getting very close to time. So, Cori, I certainly want to make sure we have time for you to share a particular rewarding experience before we wrap up this evening.
Well, I'm very lucky to have lived kind of a charmed professional life. So there are very, very many wonderful experiences I've had. But one thing that I would really single out is Hamlet, which was commissioned and developed and premiered at Glyndebourne during the 4 years that I was on staff there as dramaturg. And it was simply, it's not only a great work in and of itself, but it was the most collaborative, harmonious room I have ever worked in. I mean, there were incredibly high-level artists, the composer Brett Dean, the librettist Matthew Jocelyn, Barbara Hannigan, Alan Clayton, Sarah Connolly, part of the cast of amazing artists, Vladimir Yurovsky conducting, and Neil Armfield directing. And the level of mutual respect and trust and made everything so harmonious and so easy from beginning to end. I mean, it was hard work, but it was so rewarding. I mean, in rehearsals, the atmosphere was so totally positive that, you had the composer talking about directorial things, and you had, the singers talking about things in the composition. And, I felt like I could comment on any aspect of it. Nobody felt threatened or territorial. And I mean, it was just the ideal experience because it was so harmonious and everyone was so respectful and confident enough of their own work that they could contribute in that incredibly wonderful, free way. And the piece itself is as a result, I think, of that, so wonderful. Came to the Met also.
Well, that is a wonderful way to wrap up. Of course, all processes are not so harmonious, but if every process was easy, we wouldn't need the dramaturgs as much, right? If we need the dramaturgs. No, you were very much needed on that project and very valued on that project, I know, but it's so wonderful when a project comes together that way and the energy in the room is just so full of love and respect for all of the collaborators. I want to take this moment to thank Cori and Kate, Annie. We could continue this for much longer, I know. I hope we'll have more opportunities to talk about the art of dramaturgy. I will just remind folks that if this is a field that interests you and you think that you would like to explore the possibility of working as a dramaturg in opera, we'd love to hear from you at ALT. The applications for our dramaturgy fellowship at ALT are open. That application deadline is the end of April 29th, and Ebony kindly just put the link to the CLDP in the chat. This is a completely free program, and there is also a modest stipend available to the participants. And please share this information with folks who might be interested as well. We do need to wrap up for this evening, though. We do hope you'll join us for our next session with Liz Lerman. The information is online on our website, altnyc.org. Kate, Anne, Annie, Cori, thank you so much, and we look forward to being back with you soon. Bye-bye.